Hello. Oh, good morning. My sign is up, so we have no issues with that today. I'm going to take a sip of coffee, though. All right, so I have some really good questions for this week. Some of them came from Reddit, some of them came from Facebook, many of them came from right here on YouTube. A few were asked on later on in the week on the actual live chat. So if you are watching this at any point in the future, near future or later future, and you do have questions, please drop any of those questions below in the weekly live Q&A, sort of whatever that live Q&A is, and I will happily answer them at the next live Q&A, whenever that is. I'm going to try and continue to do these weekly until scheduling does not allow, which is usually during event season or if I end up stuck into another project. But for now, we're going to keep these weekly. And any questions you want. So anything about the business side of raising crickets, or any questions about the actual functionally raising of the crickets, how we do it, why we do it, ways that you can make things work, all of those things. Anything goes. I will get to as many as I can. But for now, I already have 9 of them in my Google Doc that I just compiled for the questions that have come up this week. Some of them are a little bit longer and will take a little longer discussion, and some of them are shorter in nature. But as always, if you have any questions and you are sitting here watching this and you want to drop them in the chat, please feel free to do so. Or if you're watching this later, like I said, drop it down in the comments and I will happily get to it in the next video. And I usually give some sort of an explanation for within the comment. I don't make you wait until the next live. We get it covered when we can. So the other thing, so I do upload a new video on a topic every single Tuesday. I believe that I am going to cover in an extended way one of these questions that we get to. So, because I just like it as an idea, and I wasn't super jazzed about what I had in the calendar as an upload this week. So I think I'm going to use one of these, because as soon as I read it while I was compiling these, I was like, oh, I like that. I think I could do an extended video about that. It would be fairly interesting. The other thing is I am starting another channel for a different project that we've gotten into. So that one, I will give you more info on that when that happens. Has nothing to do with crickets, has to do with renovating an old building. So if you have any interest in that, I will share those hopefully next week, because hopefully we have episode 1 up by next week. So I'll have the details for you on what the channel's called and all of that, because we haven't even done that. So let's get to the questions. First one is, what do you think the biggest first hurdle is in this business? And I'm just going to say, like, the business of cricket farming in general. Obviously, the biggest first hurdles are figuring out, what are you going to do with crickets? Are you going to get into food? Are you going to get into live? Are you going to get into feed? Like, ask yourself that question, and let's just go down the food path. What is the biggest first hurdle? Securing your supply. So while you maybe have the absolute, what you think is the perfect setup, perfect conditions to raise crickets, but you don't have a ton of experience in raising the crickets, and maybe more of a caveat, you don't have any experience raising the crickets at scale, that is going to be your biggest, toughest hurdle, is figuring out a consistent supply for your crickets, so that you have some sort of a predictable supply chain for you to produce your end product off of. It's great if you have the marketing piece down and you know, or at least you have an idea of where you're going to sell them, who you're going to sell them to. You might have a great network of influencers and things like that. But fundamentally, if you don't have the crickets to sell, that is your biggest hurdle. So that I think is hurdle number one. And then number two, even if you have a great network and you have all the things you think you need to run a successful marketing venture for the business, you're still trying to convince a population that doesn't traditionally eat insects. I'm assuming if you're in the West, doesn't traditionally eat insects, that they should be eating insects. No influencer network in the world is going to 100% convince everybody that that's what they want to be doing. So those would be the two biggest hurdles, I would think. But the very first hurdle that you're going to run into is getting a reliable supply chain, reliable supply of your crickets. But that also goes for the live market. I think it's very common for people to get into the live market and then end up overselling the amount of crickets that they have, because they are not in the rhythm quite yet of here's how many we need to retain for breeders, here's what we, the timing of having each of the sizes at all of the times, and making sure that you're not selling too many crickets too fast and you can't replenish your population. I think that's a fairly common early mistake for new folks in the live market. That's just me observing from the outside, really, because I don't mess with the live market very much, other than somebody who thinks that their chameleon's going to die because all the local pet stores are out of crickets in the winter. I will tend to oblige if I have the crickets that they need. So getting a reliable, predictable supply built up, I think, is the largest hurdle to getting into this business in the beginning. And that is just, like I said, because the learning curve is so steep. So, question number 2, what did you do with your first products when you first started? This is the one that I think I'll probably end up doing a video on, just kind of going down the evolution of my different products, because it's been quite interesting over the last 4 years. My first products I sold at the local farmers market. That was the lowest barrier to entry for me. That was the cheapest way for me to test the market out, if you will, to see if I could even get anyone to purchase these. So obviously a portion of my very first product went to research and development. So that was, the very first crickets I raised. I had to figure out, like, what product was I going to make? How was I going to make them? How do you even cook crickets? All of those things. I was really starting from scratch. So a portion of them went to that. And then the things that I actually sold, I started selling at the local farmers market. So depending on where you are, that might be the easiest port of entry for you if you're going into the food side. If you're going into the live side, what I would recommend is using things like Facebook Marketplace. You could even use Craigslist, or just go and approach your local pet stores. Like, usually, even if you're in a smaller population area like we are here in Iowa, typically you will have some sort of pet store that is supplying crickets, because even though there's not a ton of people here, there are people with lizards and toads and things that need to eat crickets. So somebody has to supply them. So go chat with them. Find out where they're getting their crickets, find out if they'd be happy to switch to a local supplier. That's just what I would do when I first started out. But my first products went to farmers markets for the first 2 years, actually. So, okay, question number 3. What happens when some of the crickets die, but not all of them? There's a little bit more to this question, but it didn't totally make sense. What happens if I don't realize? Bad things happen. It is not great if you start noticing die off after it has occurred for a while. The biggest indicator of die off that I ever notice, and I know I have a problem, is the smell. If I walk in and there's a smell other than warm feed in there, I know we are definitely having problems, and there's at least one or more like bins that needs to be addressed. At that point, there's probably additional damage that has happened if they've already started to smell. It's sort of the same as like rotting meat kind of deal. So you want to get that out there as quickly as possible, because anything rotten in your bins is not going to be good for the overall health of your population of crickets. So just bad things happen when you have dead crickets in there with live crickets. So if you can notice it and get it out of there as soon as possible, the faster the better. I know that's not always possible, but if you can, that's the way to do it. Question number 4. What can you do with the frass? Pause, sorry. So what can you do with frass? So the frass is the cricket poop, for those of you who don't know. And it has NP and K, which are things that you look for in fertilizer or soil amenders. You can do all sorts of things with it. You can compost it. You can spread it on your garden. You can spread it on your houseplants. You can, so unlike mealworm frass with your houseplants, don't put mealworm frass in your houseplants, because you might end up with a beetle infestation. Because mealworm eggs do not need to remain moist in order to stay viable and hatch. Cricket eggs do, so if there's any eggs left over in the frass, you are not worried about baby crickets running around your house. But if you do the same with mealworm frass, you are running the risk of having beetles everywhere. So you can do all sorts of things with it. It makes really great fertilizer. We've had really good success with it on like nightshades in the garden. So tomatoes and peppers and things like that seem to really like the cricket frass. It also makes things flower faster, so it works really well for flowering plants. Use it. Don't waste it. That's what I would do with it. And it's the beautiful thing about it too is it's dry. So it's not, if your frass is wet, you have a moisture problem in your bins. There's something else going on. Your frass should be completely dry, look sort of like sand. You might have a little mix of feed that's been kicked around in it, but in general, it transports really well because it's dry. Like, so it can be easily shipped and things like that. I don't sell my frass, but you can. It's just a completely different market from what I have on the food side. So it's just not something that I pursue, but there is the opportunity there to sell it if you so chose. But easy to collect and easy to store because it is dry. Once it gets wet, it smells really horrible. So just so you know. Okay, question number 5. Hi, is it normal for the Gryllus bimaculatus species, which I don't know anything about the Gryllus bimaculatus species, eggs to turn black, since these crickets are black and so so are their hatchlings? Just want to know if anyone had bad experience with cricket eggs that do turn black and not hatching. So, though I know nothing about this species, I have to assume that the eggs are not that dissimilar from Akita, even though Akita end up brown, and these ones end up black. I think the eggs are probably very, very similar. I would guess that the eggs turning black and not hatching means something went wrong. And this person ended up following up later and saying that, yeah, they ended up, some of them ended up hatching, the ones that did not turn black, and they hatched out completely white, just like our pinheads hatch out completely white. So if you are noticing that the eggs are turning any color other than white, then you probably have a problem. Those eggs are probably not viable. A couple things could have happened. It is either the substrate completely dried out and so they dried up, but more than likely, if the eggs are turning black and not just looking like a shriveled up egg, it's probably that you had the humidity too high or the moisture too high, and those eggs actually ended up rotten. I guess it could be an infestation of something that has like come and taken over the egg and caused them to turn black, but I don't really know on that one. Like I said, turning any color other than brighter white as they get closer to hatching, probably not a good sign on these eggs. So I was glad to hear that he ended up having some hatch and they were ended up hatching out bright white, just like our hatchlings end up. And I'm sure that they turned a little bit darker as their exoskeleton developed. Um, but yeah, anytime that your eggs are starting to look darker as they get closer to hatching, it's probably not a good indication of things to come. Um, and my guess is, with the limited information that I have, is that those eggs actually ended up rotting because they were uh, probably too moist, or there was something else going on in the substrate that caused them to abort and rot, I guess. Okay, so question number 6. And I do just want to make the point again, if you have any questions and want to drop them in the chat, please feel free. I will get to them as I can, but I'm going to go back to my list of questions. And this one came from being dropped in the last comment section of the last video, so thank you for doing that. What happens if we freeze dry crickets? Is there any use of freeze drying them for edible purposes? Um, so there's many different ways that you can dry crickets. You can freeze dry them, you can microwave them, you can just dehydrate them using like heat in a traditional dehydrator. You can spray dry them, you can use infrared. There's all sorts of things. There are pros and cons of all of them. Some of them require much more expensive equipment. Some of them have different impacts on like nutrition profiles and things like that. So that's one thing about microwaving. I don't really have a whole lot to back this up. This is just something that I've read in places and I haven't really dug any deeper into it. Microwaving them supposedly denatures the proteins way more than like traditional dehydrating. Spray drying requires really expensive equipment. Freeze drying, I know you can get like a countertop sort of freeze dryer, but that's still pretty expensive equipment. Infrared is very, very quick, and I think supposedly maintains most of the nutrition profile. But I want to say that like what you would need for a usable, viable size of an infrared dryer, it's like $2.5 million. So there's a trade-off with all of them. They also, in addition to the nutrition profile, they do change the flavor profile. So the freeze-dried ones taste different than the dehydrated, taste different than the infrared, and they all produce like a different color of powder. So there's a lot of things to consider in the different ways that you can dry them. So you absolutely can freeze dry them. We don't. I haven't really necessarily seen anything on the nutrition profile of freeze-dried crickets. I'm sure it's out there somewhere. I just haven't dug into it. But like I said, I have seen things on the microwaving of the crickets as a drying method and the issues that it causes in terms of denaturing the protein. I don't know. Right now, we just use a traditional big like food dehydrator, and it works well for us. I think as we grow and expand and scale, we may look at something different. We just may look at a bigger food dehydrator. There's a lot of, it's not always cut and dry. There's areas of gray in the decisions you have to make and these things. But moral of the story is, yes, you can use freeze-dried crickets. Yes, you can freeze-dry crickets, and I think there is some value in there. It's just not the way we do it necessarily, and it's not something I've explored. So there's more research to be done. Okay, this one I believe came from Reddit, and I have one question that I haven't seen you talking about so far. Do you use both males and females to sell as food? How do you know when the female is not reproducing anymore so you can sell them? Or do you separate males and females to sell only the males? So essentially, do we like retain a female breeding stock, kind of like you would for cows when you're in dairy and any other dairy and meat cattle? I don't know. Typically, you sell the steer. I mean, eventually you sell the cows too, but typically for meat, you feed out the steers, and then that's what you end up eating as the meat. Dairy cows, obviously, you take the steers You take the bulls, turn them into steers, and then feed those out and eat them for meat. And then you keep the heifers. Eventually, they become cows, and you keep the cycle going. And so you keep the females. You have a bull or two to have calves, and then but you tend to retain the females in your herd so you can produce more and keep going. Crickets are not the same. Typically cows, I actually don't know what the life cycle of a cow is, like the lifespan. I don't know how old they can get and still be fairly productive. My guess is it's somewhere around 8 to 10 years, but I really have no idea of what a ruminant life cycle like that would be for productivity. For crickets, even in the wild, if we left them to their own devices, their max life span is going to be about 5 months. And the reason there's so much difference between the wild crickets, so at least here in the Midwest, 5 months is typically about all you'll get out of them, versus in our barn, it's about 45 days. The reason for the really shortened window is that they are not enduring temperature fluctuations. Crickets are super temperature sensitive. So the warmer the temperature is, the more constant the temperature is, the faster they are going to mature. So the reason the ones outside are 5 months and not 5 weeks is they have that temperature going up and down every night. So at night, they are obviously slowing down their maturity. So you would not be able to keep the females and keep them viable and keep them living past that 45-day cycle in the barn. They would start to die off and it would just be counterproductive. So we do not separate the males and the females. We eat them all. The females lay 5 to 10 eggs per day when they are mature enough to be laying eggs, when they only need to be fertilized once every 2 weeks. Typically, we only breed our females for 48 to 96 hours, so 2 to 4 days, and that is more than plenty to entirely replace our population that we are harvesting. So, no, we don't sort them. No, we don't keep the females. We don't need to. This person asked a follow-up question of, well, can't you keep them past 96 hours and the females will lay more eggs? They will, but their rate of laying those eggs slows down considerably and they start to die off just from old age. They are geriatric at that point, essentially. So the labor required to replace and maintain the breeding substrate in those bins does not make sense for the output. And quite frankly, we don't need the output of the eggs and the pinheads and the things hatching. All we need is enough to replace our population. Truly, with the crickets and the pinheads and all of that, we run into more of a problem of having too many pinheads hatch than we do not enough. In my opinion, that's like the easiest part of cricket farming, is getting pinheads to hatch. Keeping them alive the whole time, entirely different ballgame. But so yeah, we sell them both as food. We don't separate them out. That would be really tedious and unnecessary. And you cannot keep like a breeding stock of the females for subsequent rounds. Just doesn't work that way. So it's not like traditional livestock at all in that respect. Okay, question number 8. Oh, I covered that one. So wouldn't they lay even more eggs after 96 hours? Short answer, yes. Long answer is very inefficiently for what we'd get for output. And truly, it is a matter of keeping the population down rather than having unlimited space. If we had unlimited space, totally different conversation, but space is limited. So, okay, and number 9, this one comes from Facebook, from the Cricket Farming group on Facebook. I try to remember to post on that group that I'm going live on YouTube at least 12 to 24 hours in advance. It was kind of like 12 yesterday. So I did have one question come up for somebody who could not attend. And would you recommend this as a viable business? If you want the longer extended version, go to my upload from this week. It was cricket farming for profit, and just a little discussion around that of things you need to consider before you go into it. And always what my initial recommendation is for anybody who is going to go in or thinks that they want to go into cricket farming for profit is start small. It is a viable business, without a doubt. There is profit in it, but you need to decide what you want to do. Do you want to go the food side? Do you want to go the feed side? And then how large do you want it to be? How much of your income do you need it to be? Is it something you can do on the side? Do you want it to be your full-time gig? My recommendations on that all vary. If you have no experience in it, do not do this full-time to start. Unless you have a bunch of money laying around, or you can be like me and have zero expenses and live in your parents' basement. It's just the learning curve is really super steep. You, just like starting any other business, you need to build out your market and do all of those kind of things. So it is definitely a viable business. It is not a get rich quick scheme by any means. And depending on what you have for setup will like what you have available to you. So do you have existing buildings that you can retrofit and things like that? Or are you going to have to go out and sign a lease or go out and build a new building? Those all factor into what is possible, what is viable, what you can do. So yes, it's a viable business, but there's always challenges. So I would definitely recommend going and checking out that video that I uploaded this week that just has a larger discussion on the different options of different markets you can go into, things to consider. I think it's helpful. As always, if you guys end up with any additional questions, please feel free to drop them in the comments. Happy to get to them at the next live, or depending on how I feel about the question, I may turn it into its own dedicated video like I will with one of these this week. I will be uploading a new video on Tuesday. It will probably be about the evolution of the products and where I first started selling them and that whole story. Unless I decide that I have the one on the schedule that I really want to do that one instead, but I don't think I'm going to decide that. So yeah, upload noon Tuesdays. We will do this again next week. So it'll be February already, which is wild. 8:30 in the morning again, so that I can go get things done through the day. Right now, I am headed back to the cricket barn because we have babies hatching. I actually probably need to go buy some potatoes first, so that I have enough. And then we are gonna go do some things in Collins. So thank you guys for joining. As always, like I said, if you have questions, drop them below. Happy to get to them, and appreciate it. Have a great week.